So for this project, I needed a new tool, and that was the Milwaukee 18-volt 3/4 inch impact. This mini torque monster puts out 2,400 foot-pounds of nut-busting torque, and I was able to snag it for just $287 with the help of double stacking coupons at my local Home Depot. Now that I've got my wheel off, I'm going to go ahead and add some extra support back to the frame of the bus. I do not want the main drive axle carrying all the weight of my rig, so it's best that I just put an extra jack underneath there to hold it up while I'm working on it. Now I'm using a shackle mount to position my jack underneath. I would suggest that you thoroughly inspect this for rust before doing the same thing, and not just on an Eagle bus, that goes for any bus. Now this brake drum has been on here for probably 35 years, so I've kind of got to give it hell with this 5-pound sledgehammer. I've often seen mechanics use 20-pound sledgehammers and just give this thing 2 hard smacks to knock it loose. Now I will say that these brake drums give off one hell of a ring when you're beating on them, so it might be good to wear some ear protection. However, once they're finally loose, you'll notice the deadened sound. Now I am servicing the steer wheels and the bogie wheels, but I started with the bogie wheels first because they are quite literally the easiest to work on. I should also mention that all of the part numbers for this little hubcap here and the hub seals, cone bearings, and races are all exactly the same for the bogies and steer wheels. Now you might have noticed the hub oil was pretty burnt up, but I do want to show you another very important step missed by the previous mechanic, or heck, even the original mechanic. So if you missed it there, the original mechanic did not bend the locking washer over the outer spindle locking nut. Now I did have to use my impact to remove that, however the inner nut was removable by hand. As I removed the parts from the hub, there was obvious signs of wear and journaling on all of the bearings, and there was metal flaking inside of the actual hub oil. Now the cone bearings weren't in terrible condition, and heck, some people might even put them back. But for me, I wanted the experience, and I had gone this far with removing all of the parts, and I knew that replacing them was going to be my end game. And just looking at this cone bearing here, you can see that the chrome plating on the bearings is worn off, and there's even signs of burn on all of the bearings. Now don't worry if you didn't get the part number, I'll be sharing all that information in this video as well. Now looking at the spindle bolt, it's really not in bad condition. At first, I saw the rust and I could feel a little bit of a journal line on the end of the spindle. However, it was all cleaned up once I rubbed it all down with some brake cleaner. Not bad for a bogie wheel that hasn't been serviced in 34 years. Now I'm going to continue to disassemble the brakes all the way down to the hub and also remove all of the brake and S-cam assembly. I need to eliminate some of the weight on the torsion arm because I'm also going to be making adjustments to the torsion suspension in this video. Now I'll be honest, for me this work is not hard, but it is filthy, so just prepare yourself for having to clean years of grime and grease and whatever else is wrapped up in all this stuff. So let me remind you, I'm doing 4 wheels in total, 4 brake sets, 4 hubs and seal sets. And this is my second wheel, so I've got a pretty good system in play. I'm also servicing the S-cams, the slack adjusters, and replacing my brake chambers. Even though they're in okay condition, I'm going to replace them because they're 34 years old. And with some of these parts not being serviced on an annual basis like they should be, they're practically glued together, which makes them almost impossible to just clean and service. So a lot of things are just needing to be replaced anyways. With everything nice and cleaned up, that's going to give me a much better picture on how things should be put back together. Now here I'm using a 15/16 socket on the front and then an open-end wrench on the back. And once again, the Milwaukee Impact has come to my rescue. With me spending at least 2 days on this bus already, it's already paid for itself and what it would have cost me in service fees. Now in the near future, I'll also be doing my drive axle cone bearings and rear seals, along with the radius arm kingpins and upper and lower kingpins. So I know this impact is going to come into play with all of those projects in my future. Now working on a project this big, it really is hard to stay organized sometimes when you don't have a workshop to work out of. But one thing I like to do as I'm working along, anytime I take any kind of nuts and bolts off of something, I screw them back together before I set them down, just so I know that everything will go back together the way it came out. Now, I will say I was pretty lucky with the purchase of my bus because it also came with an original service manual. And in that service manual, there are exploded schematics for every mechanical component for this bus, aside from the 8V92 engine. Now, these service manuals are still available for purchase. However, I was lucky enough to have one already with all the original notes from all the previous owners. This was definitely very helpful as I was going through Eagle University to learn how everything worked in my bus. But I will say that you do need to be ready for some surprises, like the one I just ran into. As I removed the hub spindle, I noticed that there are 4 additional parts that were not apparent on the passenger side. I can probably just chalk this up to some sort of method of making sure that everything is nice and aligned, so I'm just going to put them back the way they go. Now, since this is my personal ride, I'm going to take the time to power wash everything down. You may not get this from an actual mechanic that you're paying for, and if you do, well, kudos to you. Not everybody's got the time to do this. However, with 34 years of grime and grease built up on all these parts, I'm going to clean them up so that I can get everything put back together properly and torqued to spec as needed. With all the parts being clean of all the grime, dirt, and grease, this will also give me an opportunity to sand things down and put a fresh coat of primer on it before reinstalling it on my rig. It also gave me a chance to cut some really cool little swirly lines on my sidewalk. Really, all jokes aside, if you have the time to do this when you're working on your rig, don't pass it up. It's definitely needed on occasion. So Harbor Freight was once again my go-to for tools in this project, aside from the Milwaukee. I picked up the Icon bearing and seal driver kit from Harbor Freight for just $160. It worked perfectly, and with 2 wheels down and 2 more to go, well, actually 4 more to go with the main axle, it's going to pay for itself once again. Now, looking at the inner hub cone bearings, you can see that they're not in terrible condition. However, there is some journaling and slight pitting on all of the bearings. So once again, more parts that are getting replaced. However, I knew I was doing this, so it's no surprise. So one last time, I'm going to let these parts soak in degreaser while I'm setting up the bogie suspension arm. And then finally, I'll hit them with a wire wheel to clean off all the flaky paint. Now I'm getting ready to adjust the bogie suspension arm. Now there is a proper procedure for doing this, however in this video I'm not covering all that. I don't need to do all of my suspension, I'm just adding some extra support to my main drive axle on my bus. Now I'm sure they make pulleys large enough to remove this arm, however I didn't go looking for one and I didn't purchase one. I'm just going to rely on old brute force and screwdrivers to pry the jaws open. It's not everybody's preferred method, but it's what I got. Now my purpose for having a jack underneath there is that I want to apply pressure to the jaws that are clamping around the torsion spindle. And once I start to pry the jaws open with the screwdriver, I believe that the added pressure of keeping tension on that spring will help break some of that rust free. So here I am taking notes of the factory markings on the spindle, and you can see I just made a little tick on there with the screwdriver, so I know to adjust that down 1 tooth on that spline or spindle. Now, 1 tooth is said to be 500 to 600 pounds of down force, whether you're going down or up. So if you want to lighten the suspension, which I don't know why you would want to, but if you want to lighten it, you would raise the torsion bar up. And if you want to increase the force down, you would lower it down. And that would give you an extra lift on the front and rear axle, or added support for, your brakes or just the overall bus. So once I've got everything set up, I've got my come along chain on there, and there's no tension on the spring now, and that's because I have to start working it loose and breaking all the rust up in there. Now, yes, I'm sure they make a pulley for this, but I really just wanted to try and do it with the tools I have, of course, aside from the 3/4 inch impact I bought. But honestly, it took me about 30 minutes of prying back and forth, splitting the jaws open. I did have to insert a drift, or let's just call it a screwdriver, because that's what it is, on the front side of the clamp and a little baby one on the back side. And that helps separate the jaws on both ends of that spindle. And then I just continue to use my pry bar against the frame and work the torsion arm back and forth until it finally started to give way. And once you get it to move a tiny bit, you've really only got about 10 minutes left of going back and forth with it. You'll also notice that I am using the sledgehammer to beat on the steel, and I'm not going at it like the Incredible Hulk. I'm just tapping it in hopes that it will bust some of the rust free inside of that joint there. Now, my stepdad was a front-end mechanic for about 25 years after he got out of the military, and he used to show me all of these I used to have a K5 Blazer, and my stepdad would show me all these tricks or all these little hacks he had, and he would always use a 2-pound sledge for every ball joint. He would just take it and hit it once dead on the end, and it would always pop the ball joints free. So I've just always kind of applied that rule and method to working with any kind of steel that is bolted or pressed together like this. But I know there are tools out there nowadays that make it much easier. But here, finally, you can see I've got a good amount of movement, and I just keep going back and forth on the top, and then finally I realize that I need to pry up because there's weight on that spline gear. So now that I've got all that moved out of the way, or now that I've got everything moving freely, just using the come-along chain or the pulley chain to adjust the height where I want it, because that arm weighs about 150 pounds, and bent over trying to get that on those little teeth, it's not the easiest thing to do. So once I got it lined up, I just use the sledge and tap it back into place. And of course I got to put the screwdrivers back in to separate the jaws, but you can see here, got it down one tooth. So that'll be nice added support on the rear axle of my bus. So my battery died while I was doing this yesterday, so it's a different day. I took the time to spray paint, clean everything, degrease everything, get a little bit of a wire wheel on stuff, clean some of the flaking rust off of here and flaking paint. I've got a new airline on here. I've got everything adjusted. I have these bolts torqued back down, and I just wanted to stop to point out these shims that were actually on this side, on the driver's side bogie wheel. They are on the front and on the back, and it's really easy to figure out which side they go on because the opening on these are bigger on one side versus the other. So the back of the spindle goes into the hub hole here, so these shims here are the same diameter as the back of the spindle nut or the spindle bolt here. I do have my new gaskets in here for the S-cam, and I do want to point out also that on the back, something else to mention is that on the back they actually sit in there different. So the back sits on there backwards where you can actually see the seal, and the front sits in flat. For all the fresh parts, I went through Weldon in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'll cover all that with you now. You can see here everything I picked up and the prices for all of that stuff, and then my total out the door price. With that, I got two new Type D16 brake chambers, the inner cone bearing and race as a kit at both sides, driver and passenger side, new hub seals for the axle, both sides, and then the cone bearing with matching race, outer bearing for my hubs for both sides, and then all four seals for both sides of the slack adjusters. Now for a bus that has over 500,000 miles on the chassis, $313 is a hell of a deal for something that could last this bus much longer than I'm going to be driving it. So I'm very excited. Hopefully this parts list and the part numbers on the invoice that I showed you will help you out when it comes time for you to work on your bus. Now I don't know if the prices are going to be the same for you when you go to purchase the stuff, or where you might source them. Maybe you'll find them on Amazon or whatever, but something to keep in mind when you do buy your bearings, always buy the bearings and the races as a kit. Never buy them individually because they are machine matched and you don't want to risk an improper fit. Once again, I used the Icon Drift Toolkit and pressed my new races in place, and everything fit perfectly. Well, I just saw the UPS guy drive by. I'm wondering if ooh, look, he did me a solid. He brought them all the way in here. It's almost like Christmas in July. Ooh. Oh, super nice. Look at this. Look at this kit. So I got my new shoes, and they're riveted on, which is nice. So my stock pads could have been sent out through Weldon. They would have taken these shoes, put in new liners, or put in new shoe liners, and then just riveted them in and disregarded my bolt holes and patterns. But I like that these are spec'd and built specifically, and there's not going to be any avoiding original holes in the brake shoes. So these shoes are really nice. Since these are on my bogie wheels, these will probably last the duration of the life of my bus, or at least as long as I'm alive to drive it. The original brake pads that were on there, they lasted for 35 years. I'm super excited about these, but I just want to go through and show you everything else that was included with this kit. So these are cool. These go in here. These are the little rotation couplings for these spindles here. And so super excited about this kit. I did not know it was going to come with all of this. So I've got everything assembled. I got the new brake chamber on there, and the brake line ran, all the brake shoes in place with the cam rollers and the safety clips, and I gave everything a nice coat of primer. So this go-around of project is kind of incomplete because I also purchased a kingpin set, and I'll show that to you real quick. I picked this up on finditparts.com. A friend helped me source this, and it comes with all the bearings, the new pins, sleeves, all the bolts you need to hold everything in place. And I'm pretty sure the metal drifts, look at that, you get all the new gasket seals, and then the drift bolts too, or the lock bolts. So here's the part number if you want to check it out. Hopefully this video was a big help. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe, I don't know, call me a big head down in the comments. I'd like YouTube to start helping me as much as I help you guys.